Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about how subtle choices we make with our language either bring us closer together or push us farther apart. One of the most fascinating things about language is that our relationships are encoded into language in the choices that we make. And therefore, the choices that we make can influence our relationships. So, this is one of the fascinating ways in which language shapes the connections between us. Hi, I'm Bruce Lambert from HowCommunicationWorks.com. Let's get started. In previous videos, I've talked a lot about the idea of politeness, not because I think please and thank you and excuse me and pardon me are the most important parts of language, but because the theoretical understanding of politeness helps us understand deep, important principles about how the social world works and about the relationship between language and the social world. So one of the fundamental questions theoretically about politeness is, how do we choose how polite to be? Because sometimes we say things very bluntly. Say, for example, with really close friends, we can be very blunt. We say, pass the salt, give me the salt, lend me $5. In other circumstances, we're extremely polite. We might not even ask for the salt, or we might not even ask to borrow money because it's too much to ask under certain circumstances. So what are those circumstances? What determines how polite we should be? It turns out it's something called weightiness. So what is weightiness? It's a combination of factors that determine how polite we should be in any given situation. And those factors are power, social distance, and the ranking of the face-threatening act. So let's go through each of those individually and see what they mean. So generally speaking, the more powerful you are as the speaker compared to the listener, the less polite you have to be. That's how power influences politeness. So if you are the boss and you're talking to one of your subordinates, you can just tell your subordinate, get me a cup of coffee, or close that door. Whereas if you're the subordinate and you're talking to your boss, you would never even ask them to get you a cup of coffee or to close. If you ask them to close the door, you might say something like, oh, excuse me, if it's not too much trouble, would you mind closing the door? So you'd use a lot of politeness. And in fact, the politeness we use encodes that power relationship. So one of the ways that we enact that power relationship is by being polite. So the first factor is power. The more powerful you are compared to the listener, the less polite you have to be. And vice versa. The less powerful you are with respect to the listener, the more polite you have to be. The second factor is social distance, or just distance. And this is a dimension that spans the continuum from being total strangers to being, spouses or family members or intimates or siblings, close friends. And the idea is the less social distance there is between you, the less polite you have to, the less social distance there is between you, the less polite you have to be. The greater the social distance, the more polite you have to be. So with a stranger, you have to be extremely polite when asking them to do something. So that's why when you bump into a stranger, say at the movie theater or something like that, oh, pardon me, excuse me, no, my fault, no. You'd be very deferential to a stranger typically. Oh, and if you have to ask a stranger for a favor, you'll be very polite. If you have to ask them the time or for directions, you might start by saying, oh, pardon me, excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you. Whereas if you're with a close friend or a family member or your spouse, you just say, what time is it? Or excuse me, or get out of the way, or something like that. And again, the intimacy between us is encoded in the language or enacted in this small amount of politeness. One of the ways that I show that I'm intimate with you, one of the ways that I act that out in social interaction is by not being too polite. Now, you might think that is perverse, that the people who we're close to, we should be more polite to because politeness is a sign of love or something like that. But really, politeness encodes our relationships in a slightly different way. By not being too polite, we are enacting the intimacy between us. And one of the ways that we show social distance is by being very polite. So if someone who you know well is very polite to you, it's going to be odd. You're going to think, why are they acting cold to me? So that's the second factor, social distance. The more social distance there is between you, the more polite you have to be, and vice versa. The third and final factor is the ranking of the face-threatening act. So a face-threatening act is anything we do that threatens a person's desire to be left alone or to be liked and approved of. So all sorts of things we do in everyday interaction are face threatening. They carry the potential of causing someone to lose face. And politeness is a set of strategies for managing routine threats to face. So the higher the ranking of the face-threatening act, the more polite you have to be. So some face-threatening acts are more intrinsically threatening than others. So for example, criticizing the sports team that someone likes is less face-threatening than criticizing their religion, for example. Or criticizing their handwriting is less face-threatening than criticizing their mother or their spouse's looks. So borrowing a nickel is less face-threatening than borrowing $1,000. So some acts are intrinsically less face-threatening than others. And the more face-threatening the act is, the more polite you have to be. So the more, if you want to borrow $1,000, you're probably going to start off by saying, I wouldn't even ask this if I didn't absolutely have to, and forget about it. I'm not even going to ask this. It's too much. Well, I tell you, do you mind if I ask? All this hedging and stuff because you have to be so polite to do such a face-threatening thing. On the other hand, to someone who you know well, you just call up your mother or your father. Dad, I need $1,000. So I mixed up my social distance and ranking things. So ranking is just about the ranking of the face-threatening act. So you're standing at a Coke machine, even to a total stranger. If you just need one more quarter to buy a Coke, you might say to a stranger, could I borrow a quarter? You would never say to a total stranger, could I borrow $1,000? The ranking of the act is just too much. It demands more politeness. So that's it. There's only 3 factors that influence the ranking of a face-threatening act. That's power, social distance, and ranking. But the interesting thing about this is that it doesn't just influence our choices about how polite to be, but we can read backwards through how polite people are to us, and we can read back into what must their values for power, distance, and ranking have been. So if someone who we don't know very well speaks to us very casually without much politeness, we think they must think we're closer than I think we are. Or if one of your subordinates speaks to you in a very familiar way, you would think, they must not understand the power relationship between us. So the way our decision about how polite to be is influenced by weightiness, but at the same time, when we look at how polite other people are to us, we can read back through their words and interpret what they must have been thinking about power, social distance, and ranking. Now, the example I often think of is I was once walking through the halls at my office at a university, and my first name is Bruce, right? So a student just shouted across me the hall, "Hey, Bruce, what's up?" And I thought, in this setting, it was a College of Pharmacy setting where I was working, and people normally call me Dr. Lambert. I don't insist on that, but that's what people would call me normally. So this student would say, "Hey, Bruce." And I thought, that's a very familiar form of address. He must think we're much closer than we actually are. He must think the social distance between us is much smaller than it actually is. So that's it. These ideas about politeness show us how our subtle language choices actually influence the nature of our relationships, especially feelings about power and social distance. So we can make some language choices that make us feel closer together. We can make other language choices that make us feel further apart. I hope you've enjoyed this simple lesson in politeness and the way it affects our relationships. If you did, please press the like button and press the subscribe button and click on the little bell that lets me notify you next time I make a video. If you really like this, subscribe to the channel. We really could use some more subscribers. Go on over to howcommunicationworks.com and sign up for our mailing list. And go down below and write us some comments and tell you what you think of this video or what you'd like to learn in other videos about communication. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you soon.